Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, desolate serfs, peasants, vassals, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to China because I kind of stay away from a lot of videos about China because once you start getting into all the numbers and the everything that's going on in China, it's just so immense and so complex. But at some point, I do plan to do a pretty sizable chunk of videos on what's going on in China because it is amazing and it has a huge effect on the world and it has a lot to do with the future. So that's one of the reasons why it's very, very important to keep an eye on China because China will have a lot to do with what the world is going to look like in the future. So anyway, one topic I will tackle though is something that's I've always said for many, many, many years, and not to say that other people don't know this, but considering the general population out there and the way they talk about China, it seems like people are unaware of the fact that the numbers that come out of China are bullshit, or maybe more appropriately, panda shit. So let's use the term panda shit. So they've now we have a situation where China's in the slowest growth rate that they've had in 25 years, supposedly hovering in the 6 to 7% zone. And but if you look at a lot of other indicators, it shows that these numbers are a lie. And so let's get into that. I got a couple articles that I attached below that go into this a little bit. First one talks about a Chinese economic professor that suggests that China's actual GDP may be as low as 4.3% to 5.2%. And granted, that would be pretty impressive in a lot of countries in the world today, but for China, it's pretty stunningly low, and it would have a lot to do with China's economics condition if people certainly knew the real numbers. But of course, that's true of every nation on the earth. And that echoes the analysis from Barclays and other major analysts, financial and economic analysts in the world, who kind of put Chinese GDP around 4 to 6%. So apparently, most people know about this, and of course the banks and the U.S. government acts accordingly a lot of times, reacting to or having interactions with China with the foreknowledge that the numbers are a lie. Of course, once again, the U.S. government's numbers are all lie too, so it doesn't really matter. So Chinese official rate for 2015 was 6.9%, but is actually probably almost half of that or 2/3 of that. And most observers, including these banks, try to analyze the numbers using alternative methodology that isn't subject to political pressures. And I'd like to see the same thing done to GDP numbers in euros in the Eurozone in the United States as well. But they look at electricity consumption, thermal power generation, the volume of loans, railway freight volume, output from iron ore, plate, glass, cement, and steel industries. And that's more telling of where the actual GDP numbers are. And just one example that shows that this analysis is on the right track is that railway cargo fell nearly 12% last year. So do you think that railway cargo fell nearly 12% last year and that their GDP is still at 6.9%? And the Chinese government, I would suggest, well, anyone would suggest, is aware and encourages and facilitates a lot of this cooking of the books. It's done on a local level, and a lot of it is because of these certain conditions and standards are set for all these regional banks and regional businesses, and they have to lie and cheat and cook their books in order to meet these standards that are expected, so the Chinese government can come out and throw around these impressive numbers. And so the Chinese government certainly is part of that, but perhaps they've got in a little deeper than they would suspect when you look at underneath the surface. I'll get more into that later, videos on China. But Chinese economic professor goes on to say that he believes, quote, that it's more probable the industry and construction grew at most 2%, maybe 0%, not the 6% as claimed. So he's even looking at one sector and saying, looking at how the numbers are cooked. And of course, the famous story most people are aware of now, China's top economic official was quoted in a leaked U.S. diplomatic cable from WikiLeaks that China's GDP numbers were, quote, man-made, unquote. So I also find it interesting that uh, Chinese have a phrase for cooking the books. It's called water injection. So interesting little tidbit there. But of course, Chinese officials respond that China's economic data was, quote, valid and reliable, and its methodology in line with, quote, global standards, unquote. Unquote. So that's certainly no panda shit there, because they are certainly in line with global standards when you have Eurozone countries, including prostitution and drugs, the drug trade in their GDPs. And of course, we know the United States is famous for counting liabilities as assets in the GDP as well. So all the numbers are cooked from everybody. So nobody needs to single out China. It's just the dramatic difference between China cooking the books and some other countries can be that much more impressive. And then we have one of the best ones I like, and one of the things that made me want to do this video right now is the fact that Wang Bon, this Chinese official in charge of statistics and GDP of all things, was recently, quote, arrested, unquote, for corruption. He was the head of National Bureau of Statistics. In actuality, he's only put under investigation, but I guess in China that's pretty much the same as being arrested. But I saw the video of him talking about how robust the Chinese stock market was after it just had its most recent crash, and kind of looks like an idiot to me, but maybe that's who they want in that position. Maybe that's the kind of people we see put in charge in China as well. Why not? We have people in the United States that are idiots as well, that have high government positions. And then last but not least, to go into this whole idea that the Chinese economy is weaker than a lot of people seem to think. There's a video I'll attach below that had a good summary of 5 obvious signs that the Chinese economy is a lot weaker than people think. And of course, the number one, stock market is very unstable. We've seen that. The volatility in the Chinese stock market is amazing. It's hard to believe anybody would want to get involved in that. But of course, the people that are involved in it aren't necessarily willing participants. And then number 2, of course, the GDP is a huge lie, as we've talked about. All the numbers that come out of China are huge lies, like everywhere else. Number 3, they're cutting their interest rate 6 times this year. And that's another sign we see. Of course, the same thing going on in the Eurozone and elsewhere in the world, and more or less in the United States. Even with this small increase recently, that's certainly no sign of economic strength. Number 4, of course, they have a huge unemployment problem. And so, of course, every country in the world, including the United States and the Eurozone, has a huge unemployment problem. But you look at the magnitude of China's population, of course, any unemployment problems become a serious issue, not the least of which because when shit goes down in China and economic conditions deteriorate, people get in the streets. And we find that exemplified in China, and we see it in the Eurozone as well. Not so much in the United States, all fat and happy. But a good example is a Chinese coal company that fired 100,000 people at one time. So that gives you a magnitude of how these effects can be huge in China. And once again, the official numbers that come out from China about unemployment say they have very stable and low unemployment, have for at least 2,000 years. And then number 5, of course, a problem that we're going to see in other countries in the world, including Japan and the Eurozone, is age. There's too many old people, not enough young people, and we know what the results can be there when there's not enough people, young people working, and there's a lot of old people to be taken care of, and the increased government costs, entitlement programs, and so we see, in China, a good example of some of the hazards of government intervention. For example, it may seem like a good idea to them at the time to take such an audacious move that you couldn't do anywhere else in the world, of having people required to only have one child. And now, of course, they didn't have the foresight or the intelligent analysis to figure out where they were going to end up now. And of course, now it's going to take a long time to fix. So they're going to have some real problems there. And I think this is really important to discuss the fake numbers coming out of China, even more so than a lot of countries, because like I say, there's this perception that China somehow is going to be this challenge to the United States, either militarily or economically, and that's only true to the extent that you believe what's coming out, these numbers that are coming out of China. when you look at the reality, things are a lot less impressive. And once again, we have a paper dragon with all these ghost cities and all these projects that are built in order to just increase the GDP and the population as well, having to move into this middle class zone, and all the machinations going on in China to try and create a consumer class, and in order to compensate for the contraction economically overall, they need to expand their consumer class, and that's what everybody's eyeballing. That's what the Eurozone and the United States are counting on in the future too. But like I say, that's a topic for another video. But like I say, it's important to look at the actuality in China, so that all these people that talk about World War III scenarios and the world currency reserve going to China and all this other stuff, maybe needs to take a closer look at these economic realities. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.